Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here with us. Welcome to the first segment of our Palestine Land, Life, Dignity speaker series. I am Irene Khalis, Director of Arab World Studies in American University's Department of Critical Race, Gender, and Culture Studies. For those in our community who may not be able to see me, I have short brown with white hair. I am wearing a black shirt and glasses and have an olive tree of life, a tree of life art image as my virtual background.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Rochelle Davis. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a white middle-aged woman sitting in a blurred background, and I have glasses and blondish hair. And I am delighted to be co-host and co-organizer of this series with Irene, and I'm also an associate professor of anthropology in the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University.
The title of today's event is Mapping Decolonized Futures. It features our keynote, Dr. Nour Joudah, who will be introduced shortly. And we receive you with warmth and appreciation, Dr. Joudah. The Palestine Land, Life, Dignity series is a collaborative initiative between American University's Arab World Studies and Georgetown University's Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. And it has been a real pleasure to partner with my colleague, Professor Davis, and the wonderful team at CCAS. At AU, we wish especially to thank some folks, Shani Ramwani, the Director of Special Events in the College of Arts and Sciences, as well as webmaster Thomas Meal, and Dylan Singleton, website coordinator. At Georgetown, CCAS's Senior Director of Programs, Dana Eldarani, and Event and Program Manager, Coco Tate. Thanks to each of you for helping to make this initiative a reality. We also wish to thank our live captioners with us tonight who make our events more accessible. Just a few brief announcements before we begin. This event is happening via Zoom webinar, which means that the audience's video and audio are automatically turned off. The audience members can interact with panelists via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We encourage students in particular tonight to submit your questions and identify yourself as such if that feels okay to you. Live captioning will be available throughout the event. Please access this service by clicking on the CC closed captioning icon in your toolbar. And finally, the event is being recorded and will be available for viewing and sharing on our series webpage in a few days. As I begin, I wish to honor our Palestinian ancestors who are no longer with us, but have made our lives and voices possible. We pay our respects this evening to the original stewards of these stolen Indigenous lands on which both American and Georgetown University sit. We honor the Piscataway elders and communities of the DMV area who continue to survive the settler colony. We remember the enslaved Africans stolen from their homelands, whose subjugation and unpaid labor built the country known as the United States, and who make all of our lives possible today. The Palestine Land, Life, Dignity series explores the Palestinian anti-colonial struggle in the context of a global anti-Palestinian geopolitics. At the core of our engagement are anti-colonial questions relating to land, life, and dignity. These questions center an Indigenous ethos that envisions land as the basis of life and therefore also the basis of a decolonial practice, that grapple with the living textures of colonial existence, both past and present, and that identify dignity as the basis of an emancipatory political program. How does centering human dignity within the aims and methods of struggle force us to attend to different kinds of questions and to formulate different kinds of demands? How is it that centering human dignity becomes a radical act and is deemed to be so threatening that activists become the target of bloody and violent acts of state repression? In addition to exploring these questions, this series is also an effort to redress the virtual absence of Palestinian-centered narratives and knowledge production in our universities. This is an active absence that works alongside an anti-Palestinian bias within academic spaces. An excerpt from a student reflection elucidates the sentiments of many students across our campuses, who writes, quote, "I still cannot believe I get to write about Palestine and receive a grade for it. It seems like such a foreign concept because I cannot remember a single time that Palestine has even been mentioned in an academic setting until now," end quote. And as another writes, quote, "Even when the great public intellectual Edward Said's work is used in our classroom, it is dislocated from his Palestinian identity, which is not mentioned even once," end quote. Their sentiments are mirrored in faculty concerns of being afraid to teach about Palestine in their classes within a Zionist-dominated institutional culture that automatically casts this as being anti-Semitic. Each of the speakers in our series are directly affected by these anti-Palestinian geopolitics at both the global and local levels. From my perspective, their courageous interventions also underscore the centrality of innovation and collaborative visions in working against colonial erasures and in helping to forge emancipatory futures. Today's event recenters the Indigenous land bond in emancipatory struggles as the basis of any vision of an alternative future. We are very fortunate to have Dr. Joudah to help us think through Indigenous mapping as a site of decolonial practice.
It's my honor to introduce Nour, who I haven't seen in person in many years, but Nour Joudah is a presidential postdoctoral fellow in geography at the University of California, Berkeley, and her work examines mapping practices and Indigenous survival and futures in settler states, highlighting how Indigenous countermapping is both a cartographic and decolonial praxis. Nour completed her PhD at UCLA, and her dissertation is titled Mapping Decolonized Futures, Indigenous Visions for Hawaii and Palestine. And it's a study which focuses on efforts by Palestinian and Native Hawaiian communities to imagine and work towards liberated futures that center Indigenous duration as a non-linear temporality. Dr. Joudah also has a master's in Arab studies from Georgetown University, and she wrote her MA thesis on the role and perception of exile politics within liberation struggle, in particular among politically active Palestinian youth living in the United States and occupied Palestine. Welcome, Nour, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. And that MA thesis that she mentioned, she was chair of the committee on, so she's quite familiar with. Let me just go ahead and share my screen and we can start. Can you see that? Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, well, welcome everyone, and thank you all so much for being here, and thanks to Irene and Rochelle for inviting me. It's a real honor for me to be here today, starting this wonderful series of talks. And as an alum of the Arab Studies program at Georgetown, it's also kind of a full circle moment to come back and do this. It's rare, I think, or at least rarer than many of us would like, that conversations on Palestine are centered around possibility and potential. But for Palestinians and individuals who have spent their careers or lives as activists studying and working for Palestinian rights, it's actually what drives us most. Along these lines, my research is first and foremost about embracing Indigenous futures and having faith in the potential of the past and present to create something new moving forward. Academic research and the media, I think, can often present collective refusal to surrender in a very narrow frame of resistance, limiting and confining what we see as community power to this idea of survival despite loss. This survival despite narrative regrettably places elimination and displacement instead of creativity and growth at the core of conversations on Indigenous duration. And while it's certainly true, right, that settler colonial invasion is a structure driven by the former, by elimination and displacement, Indigenous resurgence is empowered by the latter, and a belief that each of us have the ability to shape what comes next, that the future is not inherently resistant to liberation. So in my work, I look specifically to mapping initiatives, as have been mentioned, for Palestine and Hawaii. And today I'll try to share a glimpse of some of those Indigenous efforts that defy what I call settler temporalities and work to actively build more emancipatory futures. So although I want to spend most of today discussing Palestine and Hawaii, I do want to take a brief step back and also introduce the site and case that inspired my larger project, which actually was Algeria. My draw to Algeria was due to two things: a fascination with the debate, on its status as a settler colony, and the story of the counter-state during the War of Independence. So in July 1954, 4 months before Algeria's National Liberation Front, the FLN, launched the War of Independence, and 2 years before it adopted its political platform, it established a counter-state to French Algeria and redrew the map. They transformed the 3 coastal French departments into 6 wilayat, or provinces, each wilaya with a corresponding political and military leadership. The Algerian resistance defied French spatial organization of their communities, their cities, and their state, beyond just the abstraction of anti-colonial discourse. In a very material sense of embodied experience, the FLN's new map became a guidepost for how Algerians understood their cities and districts. And the wilayat were a living countermap to the colonial state and of its colonized indigenous population. Taking the audacity and perhaps even humor of their endeavor one step further, they mapped their 7th wilaya onto Paris, confronting colonial logic on the boundaries of the French state. They said, if France can map onto us, why can't we map onto France? My research into this period is really what inspired my turn to exploring maps as practice and gateways for exploration, eventually leading to the heart of this project, understanding that Indigenous communities are using mapping as an imaginative decolonial praxis. Due to travel restrictions, I was unable to fully integrate Algeria into the comparison. However, it is undeniably where my most important questions began, so I wanted to share that with you today. Now, when Patrick Wolf writes that settler colonialism has been, quote, impervious to regime change, he's not saying that decolonization is impossible, but that it's a structure that can't be dismantled by one election, political party, campaign, or policy. If we look at a case like Algeria, one finds a process that highlights this reality, right? Algeria today is, and Algeria's War of Independence then, was more than anti-colonial struggle. Settler evacuation is neither the end point nor the example of successful decolonization or complete decolonization. Algeria's relationship with France is more than lingering post-colonial relation. Its counter-state period, as well as its post-independence remappings, 2 of which come after independence, highlight that lack of spatial separation among empire, settlement, and internal colony that authors like Tuck and Yang lay out. One could choose to understand the FLN mappings as response or moves towards status recognition. However, I would argue that they are about something else altogether. They are a look inward, a reconfiguration of Indigenous spaces, and a prime example of what Indigenous author Glenn Coulthard calls a critical individual and collective self-recognition. So if we understand here Indigenous resurgence as Coulthard and Simpson and Alfred do, not as a desire to return to the past, but a way to escape the rigidity of the present, we can, as academics, disciplines, and neighbors, stop relegating Indigenous life to a distant past or a difficult entrenched present. So for the majority of the talk today, I will be sharing with you my work on the Palestine Land Society's competition for reconstructing destroyed Palestinian villages. However, I also want to give a peek at some of the comparative work with Hawaii, especially in relation to online archives. These two sections of my research are the most intimately related when it comes to the role of Indigenous experiences of time, which will be the main focus of the talk today. So in Hawaii and Palestine, projects to gather colonial maps, document native place names, and revive Indigenous mapping practices and spatial histories are not undertaken and tucked away for the mere sake of documentation. They are part and parcel of ongoing political projects and movements seeking to remap what was destroyed and rebuild new life in those spaces. Countermapping initiatives that involve or start as largely archiving projects develop imaginative cartographies and become, both for the makers and users, tools of decolonial praxis. What becomes apparent when I look at projects like Palestine Open Maps by Visualizing Palestine and the Papakilo and Kapuka databases by the Office of Hawaiian Affairs is that a wide network of sources informs their development, and that these databases have come to play a very unique role in the Indigenous communities and movements which they're a part of. Now, physical archives, as we all know, often conjure this image of large rooms and distant locales, rows of shelved files and stacks of old dusty documents to be painstakingly sorted. These digital platforms, on the other hand, provide incredibly aesthetically vibrant interfaces, open access to the larger public regardless of location, and a vested interest in growing via user input. Both initiatives highlight a longer trajectory of Indigenous research and a dozen or more other archives, oral history collections, land surveys, property deeds, and more that are within them. These sources form images not only of a robust Indigenous past tied to place, but the potential for a decolonized future that considers more than, quote, locational values. Archiving Indigenous spatial histories, in turn, fills a present and future landscape that imagined settler geographies have insisted have been permanently emptied. One of the countless contradictions of colonial modes of domination is the colonizers' love of archives and of, quote, preserving not Indigenous peoples themselves, but a record of them. In order to legitimize its present, colonial regimes craft a temporality that limit the past's relationship to the future. This paradox manifests in the archival realm as meticulous documentation with simultaneous dismissal, confining the past to a moment and insisting on its irrelevance for the future. In the settler colonial context, Indigenous communities that actively employ memory to counter claims of settler discovery are accused of refusing to move forward and are re-relegated to the past when addressing present struggles and future potential. You know, that quintessential between a rock and a hard place, damned if you do, damned if you don't. However, these settler attempts at controlling temporal application are more than acts of obfuscating an ongoing history. They are also reflections of distinct experiences of time. Indigenous duration not only affirms survival, but it also embraces an unconfined temporality. It is a state of living through and in the past and future daily. For Palestinians, we would call this samud, with every moment inextricable from the other. Just as settler colonialism destroys to replace Indigenous spaces, I argue it does the same with producing time. More than historical erasure or extending dispossession to the archive, it refuses the possibility of an Indigenous future because it would be forced to reckon with its own failures. The pathological denial here is not without purpose. An essential component to settler colonialism's logic of elimination and the structured ongoing nature of invasion is destroying any holistic temporality that allows for and works towards Indigenous futures. Part of that colonial love of archive, of preserving a record of Indigenous people, is that the scientific and commercial value of that record resides in the fact and belief that it cannot be duplicated. Indigenous archiving defies this colonial belief. the indigenous labor of building databases of colonial materials and indigenous knowledge, and the consequence, more importantly, of redefining terms, limits, and purposes of this documentation is a direct and targeted challenge to temporal ownership, as well as the settler need to entrench the present as a fait accompli. If considering the territoriality of states in historical context is meant to break the binding of what we call in geography the territorial trap, then indigenous activation of pasts as a move toward liberated futures shatters what I call the settler colonial temporal trap. So these new archives that you see here do more than recover colonial records of them and their lands, but are actually collections by and for their communities with no linear limitation on expression or experience of time. So now I'd like to turn to the village designs of Palestinian architecture students. Like the creation of the online archives and the map platforms, resurgence here is exemplified not by placing one temporality above another in importance or focus, but instead merging experiences and expressions of time. Mahmoud Darwish once wrote that in 1 minute, the whole life of a house ends, that a house murdered is also mass murder, even if vacant of its residents. He goes on, as the memory of things get murdered, he says, they all scatter in fragments like beings. Items break like their owners break, because all these things are the memories of people who were emptied of things, and the memories of things that were also emptied of people. Often nostalgia and imagining the future are seen as dichotomously opposed temporalities and spaces. However, critical acts of remembering, especially with Indigenous struggle, is an inextricable part of imagining the future and working to realize it. The Palestine Land Society competition, which I'll lay out here, exemplifies how mapping can serve as imaginative, generative practice, understanding that Indigenous resurgence, again, is not about a return to the past, but a way to escape the rigidity of the colonial present. I propose that countermapping by way of imagining future spatial expression is both a form of resurgence and a challenge to the narrative of linear settler time. So the Palestine Land Society competition, which you see a poster for here, the competition begins in 2017, and it charges Palestinian architecture students with reconstructing and designing the destroyed villages of 1948. As an initiative, it builds on the organization's and Salman Abu Sitta's decades-long work to archive, publish, and reframe mostly British mappings, now taking a step toward reviving pre-Nakba spaces. As a large majority of the hundreds of destroyed Palestinian villages were never actually built over by Israeli settlers, PLS is also challenging the Israeli argument of unavailable space for refugee return. This current project is the fruit not only of the documentation in publications like the Atlas of Palestine and more recent historical work on the Palestine Exploration Fund, but a larger project at PLS to engage in material possibilities of refugee return. So with almost 10,000 files of archival material, PLS has robust folders on approximately 480 destroyed Palestinian villages. Participating students are given historical data, hand-drawn maps from living Nakba survivors, many of which were taken from hundreds of village histories, British mandate surveys, current Google satellite imagery, and demographics of the residents and descendants. Abu Sitta, PLS's founder, told me that the competition follows naturally from the process of documentation. We asked ourselves, he said, what do we do with all of these village files? We must make them usable, and we ended up here. Currently, 8 universities are participating, 5 in Palestine, 2 in Jordan, and 1 in Lebanon. This expanded to include Palestinians in the US and Europe in 2020. University students majoring in architecture and urban planning redesign these villages on the same village site, but with updated services using data on projected population. These submissions include the design for rebuilding the village today, as well as a written component which considers historical characteristics of the location. So using my access to the maps and data provided by PLS to the participants, as well as their final submission, I analyzed the past and present, how past and present information is incorporated and prioritized in these future designs. Additionally, I incorporate about a dozen interviews and 3 focus groups related to the competition and related projects. So let's take a look at some of these. While PLS has set certain parameters for the participants, students are largely free to explore and interpret as they see fit. They're asked to keep villages on the original site and lands, preserve remaining landmarks, and incorporate as much data as possible. Despite these limited parameters and an incredibly diverse set of submissions in the last 5 years, interestingly, a large majority of the submissions have a series of common key features. Some are less surprising: public squares, museums, attempts to address new road systems, and the use of oral histories and Google satellite images. But perhaps the most interesting commonality is the presence of what are called guest houses or reunion hostels for refugees or Palestinians in diaspora who choose not to return permanently, but would need housing when visiting, showing a deep awareness by the students of the complicated questions that would arise with reconstruction. Echoing Abu Sitta's guiding ethic that you document to know what you lost and therefore to find ways to recover it, all of the participants I spoke to insisted that for them, this project was different and did not feel like another cultural endeavor or remembrance of the Nakba. Before we take a look at some of the specific designs, I want to suggest a shift in how we understand dwelling space and its relation to time. So let's start first with what Tim Ingold calls the dwelling versus building perspective. The differentiation rests largely on the creation of meaning through activity versus meaning that has been previously attached. Ingold defines the dwelling perspective as one that treats the immersion of the organism or person in an environment or life world as an inescapable condition of existence. From this perspective, the world continually comes into being around the inhabitant, and its manifold constituents take on significance through their incorporation into a regular pattern of life activity. Alternatively, the building perspective, what he says is the more widely applied understanding in disciplines in particular, such as social and cultural anthropology, is when people are understood to inhabit a world of culture and society to which form and meaning have already been attached. They must perforce construct the world and consciousness before they can act in it. Ingold actually uses the architect specifically as a prime example of this building perspective. The architect, he says, wants first to plan and build the houses, then import the people to occupy them. Ingold contends that this does not accurately reflect human experience of people's relationships to the environment, since it is in the process of dwelling that individuals and communities build, and it is only in the capability of dwelling that one can build. Excuse me. If houses are living organisms with life histories and unfolding relations, as Ingold and Blyer suggest, then what do we make of houses taken, of houses destroyed, of houses erased? So here I want us to think back to Darwish's words of mass murder and memories emptied. I am arguing that this destruction, particularly in the collective form of Indigenous spaces, necessitates an expanded and more nuanced understanding of inhabiting, and in turn, what it means to dwell before building. Nachi Blue-Barn explains that inhabiting describes a frame used for establishing belonging or home, a relation to place, sometimes rooted in possession, both of land and of Indianness, to signal differing notions of relationship to land and the related processes of legitimization for bodily presence in specific locations, individual or collective. Now, at first glance, I think it would make sense, right? It could seem that the PLS competition is the quintessential embodiment of the building perspective. However, as you listen to these young architects describe their process, another vision takes shape entirely. These spaces are not treated as empty abstractions to be organized, nor are their buildings void of life because the refugees are presently absent. Instead, they are windows to paused life worlds deprived of the daily interactions that come with dwelling, but overflowing with collective relations and legitimization. With exile and refugeedom comes the need for these Palestinians to embody dwelling precisely in a manner that supersedes the mere fact of occupation and grounds dwelling in a temporality unconfined by the present. Mark Rifkin describes Indigenous duration as operating less as a chronological sequence than as overlapping networks of effective connection to persons, non-human entities, and place that orient one's way of moving through space and time. Via methods such as storying, and here I add mapping as praxis, Indigenous peoples reclaim and remake settler colonial violence to a shared language and temporality that allows for futures and possibilities. Palestinians, like I mentioned earlier, would call this Indigenous duration sumud. More than mere survival, it embodies connection and an ongoing sense of presence. Steadfastness, yes, but a steadfastness rooted in moving forward. Until now, mapping dwelling space as a momentary expression produced in relation through interaction has been largely discussed and utilized for existing residential land and shifting paths of plant gathering at rural sites. However, I am proposing that the concept lends itself particularly well to countermapping efforts by Indigenous communities who work to both remember pasts and imagine futures. In the PLS competition, the Palestinian participants and their village designs take the concept of dwelling space into the future in a very literal sense. The narratives and images that follow exemplify what I'm terming as a dwelling to rebuild perspective. This production of space and the Palestinians who would inhabit it reflect a reality of displacement and dispossession. The spaces Indigenous communities map and dwell is not confined to one moment, and certainly not this moment. Dwelling space here is not only a momentary expression of houses and lands emptied in a distant past, but a vision of rebuilding and reviving those spaces and the interactions and relationships that once filled them. So now for the fun part, we can take a look at some of these really amazing designs. What you see here is the second place prize in 2019, which went to a group of 5 students from the American University of Beirut. This happened to be the first group submission to the competition in its first 3 years at the time. This was also a unique interview process for me, as I had the opportunity to speak with the AUB students both before and after they had completed their design. All 5 of the students were drawn to participate in the competition, partly for political reasons or family heritage, but more than anything, they were captivated by the idea of challenging themselves to design an emptied space at such a large scale. Until now, projects in their architecture or urban planning courses focused on much smaller scales, but the opportunity to imagine the life world of an entire village was something they said they simply could not pass up. They told me what makes their design so special is that it is not a reflection of one perspective, but 5. Part of Abu Sitta's vision for this competition has been to not only show the physical possibilities of reconstruction, but also strike debate and conversation over what this could look like. To hear these 5 students talk as a group is perhaps one of the most representative moments of this aspect. The ethics of group work was very important to us, they explained. Not any one of the villagers will have liberated Palestine. That will be the manifestation of an entire nation's will. We cannot deny the power of working together now or when they return. If each of us had been working alone, they told me, we would not have had the conversations we did that led to critical things in the design, like drowning the road. The Israeli road, which you see in the image there on the left that runs under, which cuts through the village's lands today, is a key component in their design. They decide to literally drown the road and revive the Ain or spring for which the town was named. The students propose rebuilding Ain Ghazal by reviving its source of life first, a new spatial interpretation of the Ain, explaining that it was not only homes and buildings destroyed, but that the landscape itself was disfigured, and that the road now cut through the fertile terraces which used to bear many fruit and olive trees. The structure they design, and which is seen here in its many levels on the right, serves both as a housing tower for returning refugees, as well as a functional reservoir to collect rainwater, reconnect the landscape, and act as a, quote, bridge between the past of the village and its future. In their second interview, having now completed the design and waiting for competition results, they were eager to show me what they'd accomplished. 6 months earlier, they had practically no design vision to share of any kind, but were enthralled with the idea of participation. Now they were jumping out of their seats to describe and point to image details. As you're driving through the main road, the first thing you're going to see is our project, which is intended to be the gate to the village. When you look inside, you see a big void. From this void, you see the whole project up to the last floor, which is the Saha, town square. As you go through, you're going to see a welcoming facade that actually draws you inside of the project. This facade is made out of a mesh that helps plants grow on it so that it becomes more organic and vernacular, so that the plants are brought back to life by the water itself. The whole project becomes alive, and you can see the life through the facade. It's mostly transparent and actually blends in with its natural surroundings. As a whole, the project is condensed into one singular structure that is retaining all the water behind. We are binding the village together, they told me, bringing old inhabitants together with the market, not in the very traditional way that a village is spread out into the landscape, but rather we condense the village to this wall to retain and create this body of water to revive Ain Ghazal. The AUB group did something in their village mapping that to date no one else has. Essentially, they did not detail a layout of homes and facilities. As you see here, on the right-hand side, you see a picture of the Ain and buildings around it. This is the idea of what could become. As the most collaborative of the submissions, not just with each other, but with the future residents of their village, the students believe strongly that the Palestinians returning are the ones that needed to have a voice in rebuilding their homes and what that would look like in the long run. Therefore, the structure and village vision they submitted centered around organic growth post-return. I think had we planned the village, it would have been very ironic because it would have looked like an Israeli settlement, they laughed. That is also a main motive because we do not want the people of Ain Ghazal to be forced to live in a way that doesn't look like them. They will have been immigrants in other places and have adopted new ways of living. But when they come back to Ain Ghazal, they're not going to just lose themselves because they've come back to their homeland. We felt the best we could do is empower the villagers, and with our architecture, give them tools to feel secure and more empowered to face past or present oppression. Ain Ghazal in the old days was a result of years and years and centuries of natural growth and expansion. And that's how we believe a village should grow, they told me. So we wanted to give the people of the village the option to do that. This sketch you see here of Beit Jibrin was designed by Lu'ay Dik at Birzeit University. He received the 2018 third place prize. In many ways, Lu'ay's explanation on a conceptual approach to village design is the most integrative of surrounding areas. He admits pretty quickly that he does not presume to know how this should play out, but insists that every reconstruction needs to also be a revitalization of relationships. The historical role of a village economically and its relationship to surrounding towns and cities was important to me, he explained. How can we revive not just villages, but these relations and district spaces? The connector between two places or two cities is not just a road, but the lives of people in those villages and the spaces between them. Here, Lu'ay's potential solution in a decolonized future is not only to revive connection, but to use the destroyed villages as an opportunity to quote, confront fragmentation and relink the already fragmented enclaves of the West Bank. He proposes, instead of restoring them under their 1948 districts, he tells me, that they be considered independent entities so as to not enlarge the current enclaves. For example, Beit Jibrin's inclusion in the Hebron district. Lu'ai clarified that he does not intend to add yet another fragmented entity, but that these independent spaces could be situated as ones that link the previous West Bank to a dwelling space in another previously occupied part of Palestine. The link is based in infrastructure and activities, with potential in the case of Beit Jibrin to serve as a transit stop between a major economic hub and a coastal city. He says Beit Jibrin would be a place to market the product of both cities through different expositions and daily markets and warehouses in the village. Lu'ai further extends the function of these linking entities to advancing sustainability, pitching the village site as an ideal location for a power plant that doubles for solid waste disposal and reuse, bonding the entities together rather than, quote, leaving each city or district to act on its own. Lu'ai's linking entities for Beit Jibrin take the dwelling to rebuild perspective one step further, as he considers the potential for an entirely new set of inter-village relations in a liberated nation. His conceptualization of new paths and roles between villages offers an additional expansion of Ingold's dwelling perspective. For Ingold, the world is not, quote, everywhere as space, but, quote, everywhere as region. Here, he defines region as a matrix of movement and replaces as nodes, as a matrix of movement and places as nodes in that matrix. In other words, everywhere, that concept of everywhere, is perceived through paths of movement, and places do not have locations, but histories. Palestine, alternatively, I would say, is perceived in terms of interruption, interrupted physically via blocked paths to other Palestinian locales and people, and interrupted temporally via stolen futures. In the Palestinian experience, exile and diaspora serve as an expansion of the networks and movements that make up the region. Similarly, the PLS competition and the students' designs are a reclamation of those paths and movements denied. With hundreds of villages destroyed and depopulated in 1948, the revival of these spaces is central to Palestinian notions of return and a Palestinian map that reflects the population of which it was emptied. These designs, the conversations involved in producing them, and their presentation to the Palestinian community is not an abstract exercise. They are cartographic practices that insist on a decolonial future, redotting the map not with historic places, but with future ones. I know that the work that we do as academics can get a little theoretical, and even some of the work that I presented today. But the reality is that these places we study are not abstract. Palestinians and Hawaiians and Indigenous people the world over have not given up on liberation or building better, freer futures. Every day they teach and model steadfastness and optimism, even amidst immense pain. My hope is that these cases highlight more than an intersection of literatures, but an injection of lived experiences into the analysis of Indigenous mapping and settler colonialism. Whether it's textual or performative, Indigenous cartographies are not merely alternative spatial representations or knowledge systems. They are affirmations of Indigenous survival and visions of being in a place structured to outlast them. These mapping projects are a call to imagine and work toward a future that does not accept settler spatial permanence as a foregone conclusion. Though counterintuitive to some academic training, I try to do the same in my analytical framework, looking to political theories of Indigenous resurgence as a guide to understanding decolonial praxis. If Indigenous communities have not surrendered their futures to settler temporalities, then I would say we should not surrender our research to it either. Thank you.
Nour, I think you should be able to see me, and I am here, and I'm going to start with a question or two. Okay, wonderful. This is perfect.
Should I stop sharing the?
You're good. I did. Thank you.
Oh, great.
Good. Yeah, no, you're big and live, and the rest of us are at the top. So good, good. So you can also read the questions as well, Nour, I think, but I'm going to ask, first of all, Eileen Findlay says, thank you for sharing with us this evening, Nour. She says, Dr. Joudah, and it's a privilege to hear about your work. But Lucia Fischel asks you to define indigenousness, and how would you respond to frameworks of indigenous that include the Jewish people as indigenous to the land of Israel? And can indigenous people colonize other indigenous people?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. It's one that comes up a lot. I would start with specific to Palestine. One of the things that you see come up a lot with questions of indigeneity in the Palestinian context is, unfortunately, and I don't know if this is necessarily something that her name was Lucia, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Has encountered, or is what she meant, but is this idea that Palestinians are or were or are somehow less indigenous because of capitalism, because of the fact that there were modern cities. Believe it or not, these are incredibly sort of common arguments. And this idea that in order to be considered indigenous, you need to be at a particular phase of development. And so I think one of the issues with really discussing indigenous populations is pushing back up against that and understanding that that's not what makes indigeneity. And the other thing I would say is that in relation to what constitutes indigeneity, I think that can be a very sort of complex definition. I'm flexible with it, but I think what's important to understand within my work and within the work of a lot of indigenous studies and settler colonial studies is understanding indigeneity within the context, the settler colonial context of what you're discussing. So for me, looking at the settler colony, the specific settler colony that you're discussing, and what the forms of invasion and elimination that occurred are parts of how we understand indigeneity. I don't think that many people, this question of realize that this question of indigeneity for the Jewish community in relation to Palestine as part of the narrative of Israel, realize that this is actually not uncommon within settler colonies, even within colonies that you would never think, oh, like the British have any claim to the United States prior to their arrival. And yet you see these narratives over and over in settler colonies. So I don't find this particularly unique to the Jewish community as it relates to Israel. It is actually a common trope of settler colonial invasion to claim not only a right to explore the land or say that the land is empty, but actually to claim previous historical tie to the land. So that's what
Thank you, Nour. I wanted to also just ask you if you might, before we continue with the questions, if you could help us think about your kind of comparison of the work that you did with Hawaii and Palestine and how that figures in to your work.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I really wanted to do a comparative study, and I loved the idea of including Hawaii, not only because as a part of including the United States, but it has also a really unique relationship, more so than, not more so, but in different ways than a lot of the reservations on the quote unquote mainland in the United States. I mean, I think it's amazing that in all of the things America has ever done in the history of its existence, Hawaii is one of the only things that it's ever apologized for, and outright said that it was an illegal overthrow of the kingdom, that the annexation is not legal. And yet we have such a gap in actually doing anything to accommodate or adjust for that. I also found that the Hawaiian experience was so particularly interesting because of its relationship also at the same time with imperial expansion in the Pacific for the United States. And one thing that I hope to explore more moving forward is Hawaii's relationship to Oceania in the way that Palestine has a relationship to the Middle East is also very interesting in a regional context. So they see themselves as very tied to this region that they're in, and the region views Hawaii in a very unique way, similar to how the Arab world looks to Palestine as an example of resistance, of ongoing settler colonial invasion, even though certainly the rest of the Middle East is not right. Palestine is not unique in the sense of that it's not the only country that's dealing with a colonial history, and Hawaii is not the only country dealing with a colonial history in Oceania, and yet both are seen as sort of these example cases.
Thank you. And we have another question coming from Sujud. How do these mapping plans play out or have an effect in real and everyday life?
Yeah, so in the last 2 years, during the pandemic, PLS has actually started setting up sessions with descendants, both Nakba survivors and descendants from the villages. And the winners of the competition have actually been presenting their plans to those descendants. So there's been Zoom calls between a winner, for example, in Gaza last year, who presented her plans to like 300 village descendants in a refugee camp in Lebanon, had her up on a big screen, and they did a Q&A with her. And they asked her all these questions, and she took feedback from them about things that she may or may not have included. So there is this interesting dynamic that's developing as the competition continues, where there's starting to be conversation, not only between the architecture students and the competition, but also between the students and the people that would actually see these designs. And the idea, of course, is, I mean, no one's expecting any one design. None of these students are expecting any one of their designs to be a plan. Many of the villages have multiple designs that have been submitted. In fact, in some years, multiple designs for the same town have been winners. And I think if anything, it goes to show that the variety of those designs and what they focus on is incredible. I mean, there was another winner from Ain Ghazal. They didn't care about the Ain at all, the idea of water and reviving the spring. Their entire design was an inspiration of the Zapatista movement. So it's very rich, and it I think exemplifies just how diverse sort of visions for the future within the community are.
Thanks. If I could pick up on what you're talking about, and maybe at the heart of this question as well, is do you find, we know that, you know, among Palestinian youth especially, there's just kind of pervasive sense of despair as much as there is Samud and resistance, and how, you know, a kind of investment in the future belies the kind of, as you said, being locked in a very specific and particular kind of present, in which your identity and your existence is pulverized on a daily basis. So do you find that through these mapping competitions, it becomes a sort of activation or reactivation or some sort of investment for Palestinian youth in the idea of the future itself, which is kind of juxtaposed with this pervasive sense of death and dying in the present?
Yes, I think so. I mean, for the students, it certainly is a way to not only escape sort of the rigidity of the presence and the entrenched nature of the violence that they're undergoing. I mean, imagine, I think in the last 3 years, each of the years has included winners from students in Gaza. And all of them sort of talk about the war in their briefs, and in a way to escape not only imagining where they are and the violence that they're encountering, but to look forward, to think ahead. I think more than that, though. I mean, even if we step back from the competition, we look at the archiving websites, for example, like Palestine Open Mounts, like Papakilo and Kapuka. These databases also become incredible resources for grassroots movements. So if we look at the Mauna Kea movement of We Are Mauna Kea, the resources within Kapuka and Papakilo databases are essential to so much of the education that's happening within these movements. And so they also become resource guides of political mobilization, more than just, like I said, a preservation of sort of historical maps.
Thank you, Nour.
I'm going to go back to the questions. There are quite a few of them. Ji Young asks, says, thank you. And what thoughts do you have on the challenges that might exist for extending this work to neighborhoods in East Jerusalem, for the neighborhood of Abu Tor, for example?
There's grassroots movements in Jerusalem. There's actually already a few projects that are happening, a lot of mapping projects happening within 48 and within Jerusalem. Oh God, they came out with, there's a big project that came out called Mapping Segregation a couple years ago that took on Google Maps. There are quite a few projects around gentrification and like further colonization within Jaffa and within Haifa, Nazareth. So those are around and I think are incredible. I think what can come of them in a sort of tangible sense is unclear. Although I do know, for example, at least one that I saw coming out of Jaffa has partnered with a group in New York, with a countermapping group in New York. So there are also a lot of there's a lot of cross movement work that tends to happen.
Can I just add another question onto that? Because Samira is asking about the 3 villages that were destroyed and occupied in 1967, Beit Nuba, Yalu, and Imwas. So are there any plans to cover those villages as well?
In the competition?
She just asked generally.
If you mean in the competition, I can't say, I'm not sure. It would be up to PLS. What they discovered basically in the first couple of years is they would give the students about 100 choices of villages. And they got feedback from the students that it was overwhelming. They didn't know how to pick. A lot of students, I suspected when I started doing interviews that a lot of students would pick their villages. But many of them either didn't come from destroyed villages or their villages weren't an option. So they would pick for also very interesting reasons. The selection of the village was interesting. But then with time, after the first 2 years, they actually started only giving students 20 villages to choose from. So they're rotating through their 480 some odd files, basically. So more than likely it'll be an option at some point. But I have no idea if it's like within current plans for PLS.
Right, I'm going to take another question that's come in. From Haneen, what has been the most exciting thing that you have found through your research?
I think honestly, I'm constantly overwhelmed by emotion when I work in Hawaii. And that's been a really interesting experience for me. As a Palestinian working on Palestine, I've always felt a, sense of empowerment working on a place that I'm tied to. And going into Hawaii, I was hyper aware of the fact that this is not, my home. This is not my research site. We talk so much as academics about qualitative methods and the ethic of field work. And as a Palestinian and having experienced so many non-Palestinians study my home, I was like very concerned about doing anything that I might not want someone to do for Palestine. And I was just so embraced by the Kanaka community in Hawaii, and it was so heartening. but also the parallels. I mean, we talk about, these parallels within Indigenous communities, something that I didn't expect in a million years to sort of see as a parallel, which goes to show how much you learn when you throw yourself into a site, is actually the role of exile within the Hawaiian community, and how much diaspora there is within the Hawaiian community, not just from specific lands that their family is from to other islands, but to other countries, to the quote unquote mainland of the US, and how much that actually is a part of the Hawaiian experience and part of the political mobilization, in much the same way that 30 years ago, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, there's been this buildup of Palestinian youth from diaspora reconnect with the occupied territories in Palestine. The same has actually happened within the Hawaiian political movement for liberation. And that was really interesting for me to see a ton of young Hawaiians who grew up in California, Idaho, Nevada, and have gone back now to either the Big Island or to Oahu, and are leaders of this grassroots movements in Hawaii. Witnessing that and getting to be a part of that in a very transnational space and within the context of solidarity was really amazing.
I want to ask a question that's really related to what you were talking about. Momal, she says, thank you for speaking to us today. How does countermapping and the PLS's competition fit into the shift from political to cultural activism, and how Indigenous struggles change over time?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think different generations have a different sense of this shift, as has been my personal experience. I think that depending on when you ask any particular generation, they'll tell you, oh, it's become less political now and everything's about cultural remembrance and preservation and so on. And some will tell you vice versa. But I think that actually what's been interesting to witness is the youth of the Hawaiian movement. Not to say that there obviously hasn't been resistance since the very beginning of American occupation and annexation, but the development that comes from the 90s on is almost juxtaposed with the Palestinian liberation movement, which becomes more bureaucratized during that period. The Hawaiian movement becomes more freeform and more grassroots, and starts to become very focused on education. So in the Palestinian context, looking at some of these mapping projects, people like Semen Abu Sitte and Institute for Palestine Studies and all of these organizations that have existed have already done a lot of this documentation and preservation work. People like Rochelle writing about village histories and putting that out there. That a lot of that work had already been done within the Palestinian context, and so you see actually, in my opinion, I think the use of this cultural and historical preservation in political ways there's a longer history of that. Within the Hawaiian movement, it's newer because they're also discovering some of these documents for the first time. And so that was particularly unique, I think, for me to see. But I think for the PLS competition, I don't see it as a shift necessarily from political to cultural or vice versa. I see them very sort of intertwined. I don't think that the students, based on what they told me themselves, see their work as cultural remembrance or cultural activism. They see it quite political, and they see it as engaging and building a vision for the future, despite the fact, for example, like Irene pointed out, of being just completely overwhelmed with exhaustion.
Thank you. I'm going to pick up on a question here from Umeya. Have there been ideas built around retrieving expropriated Palestinian land back from the settlements that are built throughout Palestine? And I think this is a really interesting question to think about in the context of post-apartheid South Africa, which or the betrayal of the post-apartheid moment in which the large the population of Black South Africans remained dislocated from their land. So that land question was never addressed in the post-apartheid moment. Do you see that playing into or featuring into the work through these competitions and the mapping practices that these youth are imagining or grappling with?
I think that's part of the purpose and intent behind the PLS competition, right? Is to say, we know that something is coming, we believe that something will come eventually. And all of these villages, and doing something with all of these villages and giving a place for all of these descendants to go, is a necessity to whatever comes next. So I think that that's a huge part of it, actually. We also have seen, about a decade ago, I would say, we had instances of populations within 48 that actually went back to their villages, like Ikrit, and reclaimed and started living there. Young people started living on the lands of their village and saying, we're not leaving. This court case has been up for 70 years and we're going to live here. And they lived there for over a couple of years. So, there have been instances of those kind of like reclamations. As far as, actually retrieving land from illegal settlement building, I would say that hasn't really happened outside of the removal of settlements from Gaza. But of course that was replaced with siege and warfare. So I'm not sure anyone would consider it too much of a victory, depending on who you ask.
Thank you. Yeah, it seemed the question was referring to just addressing this or grappling with this issue within these imaginings. Thank you.
Abby asks a question. How would you extend Indigenous countermapping to Indigenous farming practices? What would it look like to deconstruct mass settler agricultural industries? And how would you connect that to reconstructed villages, Palestinian villages?
So I'll actually switch to Hawaii for this, if that's all right. So the other major sort of focus of the Hawaii component of the dissertation is looking at a couple of organizations that have been doing land reclamation on the Big Island. One of them is called Hui Mau, and they have actually taken, similar to Palestine and the JNF's interest in planting trees, colonial powers in Hawaii planted massive tracts of land with eucalyptus trees because they grow quickly. You can sell, they get big very quickly and you can sell them for things. However, the economy around eucalyptus collapsed several years ago. And so the groups in this community have been slowly reclaiming these lands, taking down the eucalyptus trees with work from the local schools who own these lands, and have been replanting them with native plants. Part of that includes agriculture that with food sustainability, and a huge youth education program. So there are active land reclamation projects that really take on these questions. And if you look, I can another time maybe share images, but the mapping actually looks very similar to the PLS competition mappings. If you look at their future mapping of what they're planning to do with the land reclamation, they're on about 80 acres right now. And the plan is eventually like over 1,000 acres. And it's incredible. I mean, it looks as if I'm looking at a PLS competition design with what they're planning to do, but in a farming context. So there is some of this work that's occurring there. I think within a Palestinian context, a lot of it would be very dependent, I think, on methods of farming and access to water that have been heavily curtailed by the Israeli occupation. A lot of the methods that were used are also in the past in these villages, and it's something, by the way, that PLS doesn't really account for and doesn't know how it would account for, is how land was owned in these Palestinian villages, the way Ottoman land sort of functioned. A lot of this was communal land. It wasn't in one person's name, or it was in one person's name, but everybody knew it wasn't really that person's. So what that would mean when villagers come back is also something that is not really accounted for. The students kind of struggle with it, and you see them try to mention things. It's why Lo'ay kind of talks about the linking entities as an attempt to sort of deal with these issues. But I think that's something that, you know, none of us really know what would happen with.
Thank you, Nour. You're being asked to address some really kind of huge questions. So I appreciate that. Another one coming from Natan: how can countermapping and imagining decolonized rebuilding extend to the destroyed villages and those destroyed areas which are currently now occupied?
I'm not sure I know what Natan means.
Perhaps currently inhabited by settlers.
Okay. So ones that aren't empty land, basically.
Ones that were destroyed, but yes, exactly.
But have been built on top of.
Yeah.
That is, you know, that's a question that I asked Abu Sitta, and his response to me was, I think right now the point of the competition is to address what it could look like to revive a rural landscape. Because I asked him also specifically, what about all the cities? What about Yafa and Haifa and Akka, where you've had massive sort of takeover in you know, homes in West Jerusalem that we know, you know, this person owned and that person owned. And he said, I want to focus on the villages now because I think the point is to begin an imagination of what it would look like to revive vibrant rural lifestyle that would be connected to cities, because we all know that everyone's not going to go back to being a farmer all of a sudden. Fallahin are just going to magically reappear, but we have to create municipalities that can be connected to cities. So I don't have an answer for Natan. I don't think Abu Sitta necessarily has an answer for them. I mean, I think the dream answer would be that, you know, people are given back their villages and their homes. But the competition doesn't particularly account for that and is not really interested in that particular question at this point in what they're doing.
Thanks. And just picking up on that, could you just share with the audience who may not be familiar who Abu Sitta is and that role of work?
Sorry, so Salman Abu Sitta is a gentleman who is from from near Bir Saba. Originally, he'd be mad at me if I said Bir Saba. And that's not specific enough. And he started Palestine Land Society years ago, responsible for publishing Atlas of Palestine, and currently has been working on a huge project for Palestine Exploration Fund. And along with numerous other individuals, has gathered, you know, thousands of British survey maps and village histories into this large compilation for which the PLS competition now pulls from. He's incredible too. He's a really sweet guy.
Thank you.
We have a question from Mimi Nour that I'd like to ask, and it's really getting more back to, she's asking you, could you say more about the settler colonial tropes you mentioned, the claims to the land based on historical experiences or connections? And she says, what did the British claim vis-a-vis America, for example?
Yeah, so there tends to be this trope, which Veracini does a good job of laying out, about return, that regardless of ever having physically been in this location somehow, the concept of return to this land is ordained, right? So connected to concepts of manifest destiny, right? This concept of preordained purpose. And so the idea of return is actually not, I didn't know this, and even particularly until several years ago, the idea of return, amazingly, is not unique to the settler colonial context of Palestine. I think it's kind of easier to brush off in other contexts because it's so outrageous, but it is not unique to Israel.
Who did you mention? What was the scholar you mentioned?
Veracini.
Veracini.
Lorenzo Veracini. He does a good job of laying it out. Yeah.
Thank you.
We have a question from Sheridan, who's asking if there are any Palestinian organizations, or we could say even, these countermapping projects that organize with Indigenous Native Americans here on Turtle Island.
Yeah, Palestine Youth Movement does a ton of work with different with Red Nation and different Indigenous organizations around. A lot of individual Palestinians and a lot of SJP groups do a lot of solidarity work in Hawaii. There's been a lot of work, especially during Standing Rock, with a lot of Palestinian individuals and groups from different cities. Adala, different groups from kind of a solidarity committee out of St. Louis were a part of going out and showing solidarity with the Standing Rock protest. So yeah, it's the conversations have always been present, which I think is important to remember. I think within the liberation movement, it is not a new thing for Palestine to be talking to these indigenous communities, but has increased exponentially, I think, within the last 15 years or so.
Thank you.
Allison asks, she says, it's a different type of project, but I would like to hear your thoughts on the Open Gaza project published by Terraform and AUC, and how does it fit into your theoretical framing of building emancipatory futures?
I'll be really honest, I'm not super familiar with the project, so I don't feel comfortable enough kind of responding to that. But what I've seen, I think, is very impressive. I think that there are a lot of projects going on around Gaza that are really just about challenging any sense of imagination of what we can do in light of the blockade, and in light of the fact that apparently it doesn't seem to be going anywhere. But I honestly am not very familiar with the project enough to answer that question.
Right, thank you. We have a question coming from Julian. What connections can we see with the militarism and tourism happening in Hawaii, or in the Philippines for that matter, with settler colonialism in Palestine?
Yeah, I mean, I think Hawaii, similar to Palestine, the military occupation is very present. So for tourists going to Oahu, they would say, well, we don't, obviously we don't see an occupation. We're not getting stopped. There aren't checkpoints the way there are in the West Bank. But for Kanaka Maoli, on the Big Island in Oahu, these military bases take up an immense amount of land. The practice bombings, the recent water contamination as a result of Red Hill has been a huge issue. Water shortages as a result of water usage from the resorts, and average residents of Hawaii not having water in their homes, similar to Palestinians in the West Bank and settlements full of pools, and Palestinians getting several gallons a day of water in a neighboring village. Those parallels are incredibly strong. Those connections are very present. I think one thing that has been interesting to see is a lot of similarity, and also the pleas coming out from civil society in both Hawaii and Palestine, though Palestine's is more sort of situated around BDS. There is also a lot around tourism, right? So if you go to Palestine, if you're in Tel Aviv's dash, hyphen Yafo, go to Yafa, spend money in Palestinian businesses in Yafa, as opposed to, going to a restaurant in Tel Aviv on the water. And you see very similar sort of arguments and pleas coming out of Hawaiian civil society. And there is a very deep understanding, I think, within Hawaii that the relationship between the U.S. military and the Israeli military as well. So within the Kanaka rights movement in Hawaii, there is quite a bit of education on Palestine that's been done in the last 10 years. And their understanding of connection of U.S. and Israeli militarism is also quite high.
I want to ask the question that Sarah asks now, which she says, earlier in your presentation, you had mentioned that Algeria had inspired your current research. I was wondering if you could elaborate more on what lessons from the decolonization of Algeria can we apply to Palestine?
Yeah, it was the counter state situation in Algeria was really interesting to me. I think what's even more interesting is that 2 remappings happen after independence. So they go from those 6 wilaya, they go to 15, which are actually the French remapping during the War of Independence, then to 31, and then to 44. And you see in the first 10 years after independence, the government puts out what they call a 5-year plan of conversation. And for better or worse of what comes of it, the stated goal is to go around and discuss a conceptualization of the wilaya as a democratic unit. So understanding this space, these new independent spaces as communities. And that's when they go sort of from the French mapping and how the municipalities are laid out to the first independent Algerian mapping of over 30 wilaya. And the conversations that are part of that are things like industry, things like crop, things obviously like population, right, city centers, but also really complicated, problematic political things like rival tribes, who's got power, who the sort of mukhtars are in the situation, and people wanting to make sure that lines are drawn in the sand in particular ways so that they get to have a vote in the National Assembly a particular way, very much the way that we would discuss gerrymandering in the United States. So there's a bit of this and there's a bit of that. I think one thing that's important, and I mention it with Palestine, is, you know, the up and, not that I think anyone really thinks that settlers are going to up and vanish, but even in a situation which I think we have romanticized so much, particularly in the Middle East, of settler evacuation in Algeria, you still see so much that goes on in its tie to the state of France, right? Till today, both in, you know, economic deprivation and its relationship to other North African countries. I think that we don't look critically enough, particularly Palestinians, at what comes after. We have this romantic image of the settler evacuation in Algeria, and then we don't ever talk about what came next.
Thanks, and especially the failure of the post kind of revolutionary moment, which is, as you're saying, it just really underscores the importance of comparative dialogue in different settler spaces. Thinking about those lessons learned. Could I ask you a question as well? I was wondering about, well, I'll come back to that in a minute. Maybe I'll take one here. Thrisha, could you talk a little bit more about, and we're looking at the time, kind of coming close to our end here. Can you talk a little bit more about your fieldwork in Hawaii? What are the ways that you built connections and solidarities while still aware of your positionality as a researcher, as well as a Palestinian kind of connected to these issues, I would add?
I think a big thing for me was that a lot of my introductions were made by Hawaiians who were already working on Palestine. So there was a sense of, and they were incredibly active within the movements in Hawaii. And so obviously there's a sense of trust that this is an incredibly active person in the community that's introducing you. But of course, with that comes an immense responsibility, right? In my opinion, this person who's incredibly respected within their community is putting trust within you to not mess up as you're having these conversations with people. So I think for me, I mean, it sounds really cliche, but the big thing was to listen more than I talked. I only really talked about Palestine when I was asked questions about it specifically. I offered very little in that sense. I got asked a lot, to be honest, but I also didn't offer anything unless I was asked when it came to Palestine. And I really just listened a lot. I mean, I think putting yourself in spaces and listening and only asking questions that are, I think, very clearly also representative, like questions that reflect that you were listening to what you were being told and weren't just something that came up to you off the top of your head, is critically important and was very essential to the way I went about my work in Hawaii.
Thank you. Maybe we have one final question, Rochelle. I think looking at the time.
Yeah. Silas asks, what steps can be taken to ensure countermapping does not overlook disenfranchised groups who may be removed from the discourse?
Yeah, so this is actually one of the reasons I really want to come back to Algeria, because it is a way to actually show that even in sort of countermapping and resistance mapping, there's always someone that's not part of the narrative, right? So in relation, when discussing the counter state in relation to the French, it's great. You're talking about Algerian indigenous political military resistance to French occupation, French colonialism. We look at the post-independence mapping, what happens with Amazigh communities in Algeria? How does that become mapped, right? These are questions that are incredibly important. I don't think that, to be honest with you, excuse me, there is one particular way to ensure that countermapping does not overlook groups. I think it is incredibly fraught with the potential to erase, but that is not unique to countermapping. And geographers would tell you that's all mapping. Mapping inherently has the potential to erase. Even maps that are obsessed with labeling and including as much as possible are still going to reflect some vision of the map maker. And that's part of what understanding maps are. You know, there's an entire school of thought on in critical cartography that reading maps is just like anthropologists and thickness and thick texts, like as Geertz would say, and that one map can be incredibly thin, map can be incredibly thick, but even the quote thickest of maps is still leaving something out. So if we understand maps as not ever a perfect representation of something, then we're able to deal with them and interact with them also in different ways.
And perhaps also it's you know, the act of counter narrative that becomes really central, especially for those dispossessed from their land, rather than necessarily the product, you know, the map itself as well.
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at Palestine Open Maps, it's an incredible venture. And the fact that they hold these mapathons and people come to the mapathons and participate in vectorizing these British survey maps and labeling them down to the very specific orange orchard or olive grove or you know, whatever field in a particular village, the street, the school, every little detail. At the end of the day, that's still a British map. That British map initially overlooked something. There was something missing from that British map to begin with. And yet it's still an incredibly important piece of people tying their histories to that locational experience of sitting and looking at a map of, for me, Isdud or a map of Ben Majdat or wherever. It doesn't negate the experience because it's also lacking in information.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nour. Looking at the time, I think we've come to a close of our event tonight. And I just want to personally say thank you so much for being with us and for all of our—
Thank you for having me.
And being here with my colleague, Professor Davis. And we want to also just mark here's a slide of our future events, and we would love to see you at our next event, which will be held on November 1st, that is hosting spoken poet and writer Ghadir Malik, and we're really looking forward to that. Thank you so much, Nour.
Thank you guys for having me so much, and thanks to everyone who joined us today.
Yeah, thank you to the audience and all your great questions, and thank you to all of our support staff as well. We really appreciate it. And Nour, you were amazing. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you,
Good night,
everyone.
everybody. Go well. Thank you.